Great, thank you, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on collecting data on disability prevalence in education programs. My name is Leah Maxon, and I'm a Senior Inclusive Education Advisor in USAID Center for Education, Washington. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Rebecca, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rebecca Pagel. I'm a Senior Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning Advisor, also in the Center for Education. It's great to be with you all today. Thanks.
Thanks, Rebecca. We're also joined today by two of our USAID mission colleagues, Trifine Munganinga from USAID Rwanda and Laura Parrott from USAID Nepal, who will be presenting a little bit later about their experiences working in early grade reading and also youth workforce development programs that are collecting and using disability disaggregated data. You can go ahead and advance to the next slide, Rebecca. Thanks. So what are we talking about today? Well, just to give you a little bit of background, about a year and a half ago, Rebecca and I began working with colleagues from the Data and Evidence for Education Programs activity, which we call DEEP. And we started doing some work with them to really understand the landscape of disability measurement and education programming and what it means for the work that we do in advancing inclusive education opportunities for learners with disabilities. And so that is precisely what we are here to talk with you about today. And you'll see on this slide the agenda for today. I'll start with a little introduction that talks about what disability data allows us to do and the framework that we use in our work. And then Rebecca will really get into the nuts and bolts on how to collect this disability data across our education programs. And then we'll hear from Trifine and Laura in Rwanda and Nepal about mission experiences doing this work in the field. And then we want to bring it back to you all and really hear from you challenges and opportunities that you see in your work to collect disability disaggregated data before we then touch on some of the guidance tools and resources that we have available. We're hoping for really engaging 60 minutes with all of you. And so please, throughout the session today, feel free to post your questions, your comments in the chat box, and we will get to as many of them as we can through chat and through the open Q&A and discussion at the end. Let me also start by asking you now to warm up those fingers and get ready to type in the chat box. We would love to know what you're hoping to learn and gain from your participation in today's webinar. So if you can take a moment to type that into the chat box, we would appreciate it. We can go ahead to the next slide. So let's review the polling results. Emma, if you're able to post the results in the chat box or on the screen. Okay, so the first question asks whether your country, the country in which you're working, collects official data on learners with disabilities. And the second question is asking whether your USAID mission education programming is collecting data on learners with disabilities. So in response to the first poll, of those who responded, one person said, yes, my country is collecting official data. Two were able to say, no, my country does not collect official data. And two were not sure. In response to the second question about mission programs collecting this data, of those who responded, nobody responded to say that their programs are collecting data affirmatively. 4 people said, no, my programs are not collecting this data, and 2 people are not sure. Okay, so we've got some variations. That's not a bad thing. We can go ahead and advance to the second slide, please. Okay, so what does disability data allow us to do? Well, there's a lot of measurement work to do in this space, and disability disaggregated data is what we're going to be talking about today. Data on persons with disabilities, as with any population or any demographic, is essential for ensuring that policies, programs, and budgets respond to those populations' needs. And so for us in the education sector, across all of our areas of programming from pre-primary through higher education, disability data is essential because it allows us to know who among our target beneficiary group of learners may require additional support to be able to access education on an equitable basis, and that data helps us to really plan and budget accordingly. Disability disaggregated data also can tell us who may be missing or left out from our programs. For example, if we collect disability disaggregated data and learn that only a very small percentage of our beneficiaries are people with disabilities, then that may signal to us that we're not reaching the full population of learners with disabilities who could be benefiting from our programs. And then another example is that disability disaggregated data allows us to measure education outcomes for learners with disabilities. So for example, in our learning outcome indicators, when we collect disaggregated data on learners with disabilities, we can measure their learning outcomes. Next slide, please. So just to give you a global snapshot, there are an estimated 93 to 150 million school-age children with disabilities worldwide. And we know from global data that approximately 1 in every 7 individuals are persons with disabilities. Yet, as some of you noted in the polling responses, the availability of data on learners with disabilities is not consistent across the board. Progress is happening, but we aren't there yet, and we don't have comprehensive and consistently available data to inform our programs. But on the flip side, we do have USAID programs working with learners who, whether we know it or not, may have disabilities. And so we can be generating data for use through our programs. So the map that you're looking at on this slide is just an illustration of where in fiscal year 2020 we had inclusive education activities happening across the board, again, from everything from pre-primary through higher education. And those are the 29 countries that are shaded in dark blue. And those countries in total had 60 activities. And those activities, just to underscore, really present an opportunity. They present a need and an opportunity, right? This justifies the need for why we need to have this data, but it also presents an opportunity to generate this data when it's not immediately available. Next slide, please. And so just also to give you a little snapshot from comparing our fiscal year 2019 and fiscal year 2020 PPR data, we have seen an increase in the number of missions and Washington-based operating units who have reported disability disaggregated data in the PPR. So we went from 9 OUs reporting in fiscal year 19 to 23 OUs reporting in fiscal year 2020. And the takeaway here is that we have missions doing this work. And so there's a lot of collective experience, I think, in the virtual room today where we can share and learn from each other. Next slide, please. So Rebecca is going to be talking with you next about how to collect disability data in education programming. But before I turn it over to her, I just want to share with you the framework that we use to understand and measure disability. So many of you are familiar with the social model versus the medical model of disability. And we use here at USAID the social model of disability, which helps us to really interrogate the environment and identify the barriers that limit participation of persons with disabilities. The social model is at the heart of the Global Disability Rights Treaty, and it also underpins our approach to disability measurement. And it is from this framework, the social model framework, that the Washington Group questions on disability originate. The Washington Group questions are a set of questions that ask about functional limitations that any individual may experience across 6 domains of daily living. And on the slide here, you can see the list of the 6 questions and the domains that they cover. The Washington Group questions were designed with the UN Statistical Commission in the early 2000s, and really for the purpose of being used in national household surveys and censuses to identify disability prevalence and to be able to provide internationally comparable data. As of 2021, over 75 countries around the world have used the Washington Group questions to generate this data. And also what we've seen over the last several years is that these questions are being used by, increasingly being used by more development partners, including USAID, to generate data on persons with disabilities. The Washington Group short set has evolved into a suite of different tools that cover more domains and can be used with different populations. One word of caution that is important to flag here is that the Washington Group tools have have been developed to collect survey data on persons with disabilities, but they're not screening tools. They're not screening tools, and they were not designed to identify disability from a diagnostic perspective. And so they can't be used in the sense that medically based screening and identification tools can be used. And this is important for the work that we do. It's an important distinction, particularly in the pre-primary and the primary work that we do, where often we're confronted with operating environments where there are not well-developed early identification and referral systems. So for our programming purposes, it should be from the perspective of collecting data that allows us to disaggregate activity outputs and outcomes, but again, not to diagnose disability. And so with that, let me turn it over to Rebecca to talk with you about how to collect disability data. Over to you, Rebecca.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, great. So thank you all. So first, we're going to discuss the central requirements for collecting disability disaggregation data as shared in our how-to note, which we released last fall, just about a year ago. And I want to note that, as Leah emphasized, in this how-to note and in this presentation today, we're talking about collecting data to disaggregate activity outputs and outcomes by disability status. We're not talking about collecting data to diagnose disability. All right, so first in talking about the requirements for collecting disability disaggregation data, there are three sets of requirements to be aware of. First, which activities must report this disaggregated data. Next, what indicators must be disaggregated by disability status. And finally, sampling considerations. And these requirements change a little bit depending on the age of the targeted learners. So first, activities targeting learners who are under the age of 18 must disaggregate by disability status only if they're specifically targeting learners with disabilities. However, activities that target individuals 18 and older, all of them must disaggregate by disability status. And we'll talk in a minute about why this is so. Next, in terms of indicators, most of our indicators that measure the individual learner require a disability disaggregate. There are a couple of exceptions, but the majority of them, and all the ones that look at the target learners, require data to be disaggregated by disability status. Finally, in terms of sampling considerations, for all activities, we require sampling, specifically sampling for disability status, only if the activity targets learners with disabilities. So let's talk a little bit about why this is so. So first, you might be wondering why we change the guidance around which activities must disaggregate depending on the age of the targeted learners. And the answer is that there are different tools available for different age ranges. And the tools that target learners who are under the age of 18 that are validated are less feasible for many of our USAID programs to implement because they require a caregiver to respond on behalf of the learner. For ages 18 above, however, we have validated tools that we can implement directly with the learner, so it's much easier and much more cost-effective or just much more efficient for our programs to collect this data. Next, why do all of our indicators focused on the individual learner require the disability disaggregate? Well, that's because of our policies focus on understanding access and learning outcomes. If we can disaggregate our access and our learning outcomes data by disability status, we have a much better understanding of the effectiveness of our programming. And finally, the guidance on sampling. Why do we require activities to sample specifically for disability status only if they target learners with disabilities? Well, that's a budget thing. It's quite expensive. If you're not specifically targeting learners with disabilities, it's quite expensive to sample for individuals who have a disability. So we didn't feel we could require it except for an activity that is specifically targeting those learners. All right, now that we've talked about requirements, I want to go on to a set of considerations or best practices. Now, these best practices are in a best practices document that we've put together, a brief that we've put together. This brief outlines the best practices we'll discuss today and more. I'm only going to touch on a handful of the best practices in this presentation, so please check out this document if you would like to. It's short, really heavy on graphics, light on text, and easy to read. So I think it will be an enjoyable read. Okay, so well, before I jump into the best practices, I just want to say that even though these are not requirements, when we don't follow these best practices, we end up with inaccurate data or data that has actually harmed somebody. So while they are not requirements, they are just as important as following those requirements. So the first best practice that we want to talk about is selecting the right tool. And we've already started to talk a little bit about the availability of tools. So the first consideration in selecting the right tool is selecting a tool that aligns with your purpose. Now, this decision tree that you see here is the basis for our interactive tool selection guide, which will help you select the right tool. So when you're thinking about your purpose, your first thinking is my purpose to disaggregate output and outcome data by disability status, or is it to diagnose? If your purpose is to disaggregate, you should follow the right side of the tree, the blue side. If your purpose is to diagnose, then you can follow the red side. But let me reiterate, as Leah said at the beginning of this presentation, for any time we are just trying to disaggregate output and outcome data by disability status, we should be following the blue side of the tree. If you try to apply an individual identification tool or a diagnosis tool for the purpose of disaggregation, you encounter a whole set of ethical issues, including how to provide services to any children you identify as having a disability. So identification tools should never be used without a path for that learner receiving services. So once you've determined your purpose and you've figured out which side of the tree to follow, your next crucial question is asking the age of your target participants. So let's talk a little bit about why the age is so important in choosing a tool. This chart here lays out some tools that are available along with the beneficiary age of the learner and the respondent who responds on behalf of that learner. So you'll notice for the 2 to 4-year-old category, there is one particular validated tool that the Washington group has developed, but it requires the caregiver to respond on behalf of that child. For the 5 to 17-year age bracket, there are sets of tools that are appropriate for children and youth aged 5 to 17 years, but those tools require either the caregiver or the teacher or instructor to respond about the learner. It's only when we get to ages 18 and up that we start to be able to apply tools directly to the learner, him or herself, as the respondent. So this is why it's so important that you understand that you think about the age, the age of your target learners, because which tool is validated will change depending on the age of those targeted learners. So of course, you also have to make sure that you're selecting the right respondents and interviewers for which the selected tool is validated. So let me clarify some terms quickly too. By respondent, we mean the individual who provides the data, regardless of whom the data is about. So by a respondent, we might mean a teacher or instructor, we might mean a caregiver, or we might mean the learner, him or herself, if that learner is the right age to be responding directly on their own behalf. An An interviewer is the individual who collects the data. So the individual who collects the data is usually someone who is trained. They might be hired interviewers that you or your activity is hired to go out and collect the data. It might be a teacher, again, though, a teacher who is trained to collect this data. So let me give you an example. The child functioning module is validated for trained interviewers to implement with caregivers as respondents. So the interviewers are hired usually and trained to implement the tool, and the caregiver is the person who responds on behalf of the learner. All right, another consideration when you're collecting disability disaggregation data is translation and adaptation. So there are a set of tools available for you to choose, but all of them must be adapted and translated to your particular context. So you can, when we adapt and when we translate, we make sure that we're maintaining the original meaning of the questions, and we highly recommend including a disabled persons organization in this process to make sure that the resulting tool uses the right language and doesn't reinforce any stereotypes or stigma that might exist around individuals with disabilities. And once you've adapted and translated, it's quite important to conduct something called cognitive interviewing, which really is quite a low-cost, easy process. It involves sitting down with a respondent who has a similar profile to the actual respondents that you will eventually collect data from, and going through the tool with them and asking them to answer the questions and think aloud as they answer the questions, so that you can see, so that you can observe if they are understanding the questions as those questions were intended. We often do this with a really small number of individuals, anywhere from 5 to 10 individuals. So it does tend to be a cost-effective way to understand if your tool is valid for your intended audience. Next, when you implement the tool, we first encourage you to do what you can to include interviewers themselves who have disabilities, and then make sure you provide accommodations for all individuals, whether they are interviewers or respondents who have disabilities. And accommodations might include sign language interpretation, Braille questionnaires, etc. And our final consideration that we'll talk about today is ethics. At the heart of this list of do's and don'ts is the principle of do no harm, which is especially important when we're collecting and handling data on minors regarding a topic that could lead to stigma if not handled properly. So first, we encourage you to not collect individual identification data or data used to diagnose if there is not a plan to provide referral services or accommodations, or etc. And it is exactly in this case that we recommend using the social model functional questionnaires that you would, on the blue side of that decision tree, because those don't lead to an individual diagnosis, and don't raise the ethical dilemma of what you do then once you've identified an individual as having a disability. Next, do ensure that data collection does no harm. Do share aggregated data with ministries of education and health. And when we say aggregated data, we mean not data that can individually identify any learner, any particular learner as having a disability. The purpose of sharing aggregated data is to let ministries of education and health know likely prevalence rates in the learning environments in which you're working. Do obtain consent and/or assent from the respondents, and do satisfy local and global IRB requirements. Now that we've talked about kind of a high, maybe theoretical level of requirements and considerations, we'd like to turn this over to some of our colleagues in our Rwanda and our Nepal missions to talk a little bit about their experiences collecting disability disaggregation data. Leah, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Rebecca, for that very rich presentation. And all, please feel free to put any questions or comments that you may have in the chat box. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our colleagues from Rwanda and from Nepal to share their experiences doing this work through a variety of their inclusive education programming. So Trifine, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. So I will really, I'm happy to be here discussing disability inclusion data collection. And I would like to share experience from Rwanda. I'm the Gender Equality and Disability Inclusion Advisor for the mission. And I'll be talking about two activities right now. One is Mureke Dusome, which is Rate as Read. This is an early grade reading program. And the other one is Youth Workforce Development Program, which is Employment for All. So first, let me talk about the early grade reading program, which is Mureke Dusome. This is a 5-year program. The funding is 10 million US dollars, and it has the objective to improve the reading skills of Rwandan children and also to enhance local capacity. This activity has a target population of all children from P1 to P3, and it also supports public and government-aided schools. The geographic coverage is a national coverage with a particular focus on 5 piloted districts. That was during the final year of the program, starting from last year up to end of the activity, which was July this year. So this activity has been in place for 5 years, but the first 4 years, mainly, I would say that the mission was trying to accommodate all children from P1 to P3, but there was no really particular attention or deliberate attention to addressing the challenges faced by the learners with disabilities. And as the implementing partner who was Save the Children, working closely with the disabled persons organizations, they came to learn that actually they realized throughout monitoring data that they only could reach out to 1% of the learners who have disabilities. And that was a question for them to go back and really dive deep into researching into understanding the context. So last year, when they got this additional cost extension of 1 year, they went back and discussed with the DPOs and also came to a conclusion to conduct a needs assessment. So they worked with the DPOs in the community and also Save the Children, and also they engaged people from the government. They conducted this needs assessment, focusing mainly in only 5 districts out of 30 districts. The 4 first year from 2016 up to 2020, they were having a national coverage. But when they realized that there is an issue, they said, okay, let's take this 1 additional year, focusing only on assessing the disability issues and targeting only a reduced geographic coverage, focusing on only 5 districts. That's where they really invest heavily into understanding the disability and why these children are not coming to school. So when they have identified these children's abilities, around 3,000 plus, they designed another tool to reach out to their parents, the parents or the caregivers, or anyone who was caring for the children. So they did another assessment talking to the caregivers, the family members, the parents, understanding the real issues they are facing. So from there, that's when they decided again to have one of the intermediate results focusing on equity and inclusion. And in addition to that, they also decided to have custom indicators that would really help them track the progress over time. One of the custom indicators they used was like the number of children with disabilities who attend community reading interventions, and an indicator that they adopted to track progress about the parents or caregivers was the number of parents of children with disabilities reached with awareness raising workshops and meetings. This was one of the best ways to educate the community, because as you may know, there is stigma, there's discrimination, there's really high level kind of negligence about supporting children's abilities in many communities. So the activity, when they adopted these two approaches, that's when they realized that, in fact, they were able to achieve a lot and also reach out to many children, right from the number of children's abilities that were achieved during 4 years, it was only 257. When they changed their approaches and strategies, working across only 5 districts, they were able to reach out to 3,698 children with disabilities only during 1 year and for 5 districts. Whereas the first 4 years, they were only able to reach this minimum 200 something during 4 years and also across 30 districts. So you could imagine this very gap, the differences, and these come to understand that it's important to be intentional, to understand the context, and come up with some tools, monitoring the tools, but also using the surveys and also conducting some assessments to understand the context. So I'm going to move on to the second activity, which is the employment for all. This activity is also focusing on supporting youth with disabilities. 8% of the beneficiaries are youth with disabilities. And this is a 2-year activity. I would call it a pilot activity for the mission because it's the first time we implement a standalone disability activity. So it has 2 objectives. One is increase employability for Rwandan youth, particularly youth with disabilities. And the other objective is to enhance the enabling environment for youth with disabilities. We have a target population from 16 to 35 age old. And also we are focusing in 12 districts out of 30 districts of Rwanda. Again, this one is also like a learning opportunity for the mission because we designed these based on the funding announcement that we got from DDI back in 2020. And because we knew youth were facing issues of unemployment and also lack of skills for to meet the market's needs. So we decided to use our knowledge in youth programming and also come up with strategies to re-engage with the DPOs, disabled person organizations, and also the government to come together and design a thoughtful and also a more inclusive program. So this program is mainly being implemented by EDC, Education Development Center, but is working closely with 4 DPOs who are sub-awardees. So our learning opportunities is really encouraging the international organization, which is EDC, to learn from the DPOs as we implement and also be flexible in terms of adapting and also coming up with good strategies to build skills of the youth, but same time engaging with the private sector, engaging with the community so that we can challenge the mindset around employment of youth disabilities, because we don't want these youth, once they have the skills, the knowledge, to miss up on employment opportunities. So as part of the activity package, we are also working with the private sector and also employers to make sure that once they graduate, they get employment. The learning here is that we need to really dig deeper. We need to engage different stakeholders, especially the DPOs, because they know more about the challenges they face and they are able to come up with some recommendations that mission could really embrace to make sure that we don't leave anyone behind. We really value their participation and their contribution. So some of the challenges, of course, we always face challenges, but once we know the challenges, we come up with strategies. So some of the challenges mainly are how do we collaborate with the DPOs? Because sometimes the DPOs are on their side and we are on our side. And the time when we start the designs, it's the time when we really conduct some of the assessments. So how do we engage with these DPOs and also the host country players in our designs to get good information and also to get some recommendations and also be able to come up with strategies to measure our progress. Another challenge is that the funding level. Sometimes we feel like, okay, we don't have really money to do this. So the challenge is funding, but the lessons learned here is that we need to think about inclusion right from the beginning. So it's part and parcel of our design, so that when we are designing the interventions, we make sure we have the budget put aside for this. And when it comes to the solicitation, again, we make sure that our disability inclusion is being strengthened in a way that the applicants and people who submit their proposals know our commitment, and also that we need them to come up with strategies to address the discrimination, the stigma, and also promote inclusion as part of the activity implementation. Again, we as mission, we work with implementing partners to make them accountable in terms of implementation, in terms of monitoring. How do they prepare their monitoring, evaluation, and running plans? So we share with them our understanding and also some of the standard indicators, or we come up with some custom indicators so that they really keep tracking the progress as we move on. Another challenge I could mention here is about the knowledge, actually, the knowledge about disability, because even as a mission, we may say that we don't have staff that are skilled in terms of disability inclusion. So I would really say that it's always good to look out, to think outside the box and engage with other stakeholders, including like Leah from DC, because I know our mission have learned a lot from Leah and Josh. They've had visits to our mission, and also they've provided virtual support as we design, as we encounter challenges. It's always good to reach out and also learn from across other missions. That is where we get to know some tools, useful tools, and we really be flexible in terms of learning and adapting. Yeah.
Trifine, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing your experience, and thank you very much for your leadership. You have been a true champion for disability inclusive development across the board, not only in the education sector, but across the board at USAID Rwanda. So thank you very much. I think one of the themes that really sticks out for me from the experience that Trifine has shared in Rwanda is how the mission is engaging disabled people's organizations, not just to help advise on the approach that activities are taking, but really on this measurement and assessment piece. And so the strategy of working with DPOs in Let's Read, for example, to conduct outreach and identify learners with disabilities who may be, hidden otherwise is really effective in working with DPOs on the assessment tools. So thank you, Trifine, very much. Now let me turn it over to Laura at USAID Nepal to share the experience from Nepal. Laura, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. So in Reading for All in Nepal, the overall objective is to improve early grade reading outcomes among children with disabilities, and there are 4 sub-objectives contributing to this. So I'm going to focus on the first sub-objective, which is improving data quality on children with disabilities. So here we're supporting a sub-EMIS system for screening and referrals. The national EMIS system works quite well here in Nepal, but students with disabilities are not usually captured. So we're supporting early screening with teachers filling out the Washington group set of questions for the students, which it wasn't designed for or validated for, but then uploading that information to the sub-EMIS system along with other information such as the student needs a referral to a medical provider or the student should be sitting in the front of the classroom. So again, the screening is not to diagnose the student, but flagging them as potentially having a functional limitation. We're also trying to connect the sub-EMA system to the health management system and the social welfare system to have kind of a case file for a child, since these systems don't really speak to each other. So this is really challenging in this project because that's working with 3 different ministries, and there's a lot of bureaucracy involved in terms of who invites who to meetings. So that's certainly been challenging and something that, you know, we might not be able to do within the time frame of this project. Also, Nepal has transitioned to a federalist structure. So now all of at the municipal level, these different ministries have to be working together. And so it just creates an even more challenging environment to work in when we're supporting system building. So for this project, the target population is grade 1 through 3. However, early screening is conducted for early childhood education as well. And the award originally focused on 16 districts, which we've now scaled down to 10. Also, just to back up, in terms of where our project is in implementation, we're still in the beginning stages. So we had a 1-year delay due to the government, which was outside of our control. So we couldn't even do startup activities. And then the first year of in-school implementation was supposed to be last year when the pandemic hit. So currently, right now, we're conducting early screening and hope to do our baseline of EGRIS soon. So just to talk about lessons learned in using the early screening tool itself and some history. So before this project started, the government, UNICEF, and our implementing partners worked on another early detection pilot using the Washington group set of questions, along with some mini assessments that was developed by the Ministry of Education and DPOs. So as was mentioned earlier, there's no validation of this tool to be used by teachers or instructors in school. However, the government is comfortable with the Washington group set of questions, and there was really no alternative. Conducting vision and hearing tests in schools is not something feasible at this time because of budget constraints. So it made sense to do some type of screening where students could be referred and get a proper vision, hearing, or formal diagnosis if that was needed. So as many of you know, the child functioning module is validated to be conducted at the household level, usually by parents or the caregiver. However, because it's so difficult to get the parents to come to school to answer these questions, our program looked at having teachers respond to the Washington group set of questions based on their experience with students. So at the beginning of because there's no validation of using the tool in this way, we bought into a mechanism from PPL, RF Merle, to conduct research to see if there was a correlation between the teacher's responses to the Washington group set of questions and assessments done by medical experts. But the program got delayed, so we couldn't use that mechanism anymore. So our partner conducted the research themselves, and their study found that there was a 66% correlation. However, another analysis of the same data has showed that there's only 27% correlation. So of course, this has a lot of implications. Right now, our program is moving forward with home visits and community visits using the Washington group set of questions, asking parents or the caregivers since schools are closed right now. And that's how the tool was originally intended to be used. My recommendation is, since there's a lot of sensitivity around this area, if there's not a validated tool, implement on a much smaller scale with a partner that has research capabilities. As you saw earlier, there's no validated tool for screening by teachers and instructors. In terms of the government in Nepal, they're definitely eager. They want more data on children with disabilities. But it's hard to do. And so continuing to do more research in this area and testing of tools is certainly a priority. And another recommendation is to integrate disability inclusive education to other programming. So our former early grade reading, flagship early grade reading program and Reading for All were supposed to coordinate together because the Reading for All program was already in place, and Reading for All, we thought in theory, could build upon the early grade reading program, which is why we set it up for working in 16 districts, which is way too big if you're testing a new tool. or rolling out a new screening. But there's little incentive for our partners to work together, even if it's written into the award that they should be working together. And I would speculate, I would observe that even in the office as an AOR and working with the AOR or the COR of EGRP, it was oftentimes even difficult for us to coordinate on our projects. So I think integrating early screening and disability inclusive pedagogy into larger early grade learning programs, if you have them, instead of having it as a separate standalone project. So we're doing that as we're looking forward to design our next flagship early grade learning project. We'll be integrating disability inclusive education into that. And I think it'll make it a lot easier as we work with the government as well to have it in the same project. So some other lessons learned, we prioritized partnering with DPOs as partners, especially as implementation partners in the districts. However, they lacked the administrative, financial, and technical capacity. They bring a lot of knowledge and work in advocacy, but having them as implementing partners who haven't really partnered with USAID before can be really challenging. And so our prime partner had to spend more time and human resources and budget towards building their capacity, especially just on the financial and administrative part of being a sub-partner. Also, conversations with the government and DPOs about screening and disabilities are complicated. So for example, while I would prefer to drop some of the domains from the child functioning module, DPOs argue to keep some of these categories in, at least when we were looking at it, and to have teachers as the respondents. And these are just sensitive issues. And just like programmatically, in terms of challenges or lessons learned, I think we can get quite ambitious when we're writing our program description sometimes. So I think our scale was a little bit too large. And we also did co-creation at the beginning when we were in the program design. And we had already drafted a PD and then shared it with the government, DPOs, and we had a 2-day co-creation workshop, but I think it was too short. So if I went back and did it all over again, we'd probably put out an RFI and then hold a number of consultations one-on-one or in group settings, and then put a draft together instead of showing them a draft already that we had already baked, to really make it more inclusive. Let's see. I just think in terms of opportunities, there's a lot more interest in fundings in this space, especially from other donors and NGOs. So there's a lot of good opportunity to coordinate with others who are working in this space, especially in Nepal. That's it. Thank you.
Laura, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. I really appreciate how open and frank you have been with sharing the experience from Nepal through Reading for All and the challenges, the many challenges that you've encountered and how you've responded to those challenges. I think that many of our other mission colleagues and I can certainly relate to the challenges that you've identified from the pre-primary, primary grade level space. There are just so many nuances to this work in that area, and so appreciate very much your thoughtful approach. We talk a lot about taking an incremental approach to disability inclusive education. We understand that disability inclusive education does not happen overnight, and that it really is a process and a journey. And I think that what we've heard from Laura and Nepal really points to that journey and really the importance of understanding the local context and making that incremental change as much as possible, and working alongside, as in Rwanda, working alongside with local disabled people's organizations as kind of providing that guidepost along the way. So let me turn it back over to Rebecca, and we'll talk about some challenges and opportunities.
Great. Thank you so much, Leah and Trifine and Laura. So we've heard some challenges and opportunities from Trifine and Laura. We heard things like the mindset of others in the environment, like the private sector. We heard challenges with collaboration and coordination with DPOs, the government, and between partners. We heard funding, knowledge and capacity, and availability of validated tools. We'd like to take just a minute or two to give you all a chance to share, based on your experiences, what challenges and opportunities have you encountered in disability measurement? We're probably going to take just about 2 minutes for this. So you're welcome to share in the chat, or if you'd like to raise your hand, to raise the hand icon, which is at the bottom of the screen in the very middle of the icons, and share, we would like to give you that opportunity. So I'll pause for a moment and give you the chance to raise your hand or write any challenges you've encountered in the chat.
Ria,
Great,
thank you.
Meiko, go ahead.
Do you want me to read my question?
Sure.
So, I mean, in general, thank you for those two great presentations. Really, I'm starting putting the pictures together, but I still have something more to understand. So when we are talking about data disaggregation, disability prevalence, we are looking at, in general, at our student population just to understand the population. But when we do my first question was, so when we do when we run these validated instruments that you have listed, are we surveying the whole population, or we could survey the sample? And I guess if we are talking only about looking at our students' population from demographics perspective, like what is the prevalence? So I understand that then we probably will sample them. But in real life, in the reading programs, in education programs, for instance, in my program, I have inclusive education as a little subcomponent of the basic education program. And when I have a reading assessment of primary grade students, how should I disaggregate my data? Because on one hand, I have sample based on different factors like geographic distribution, grades, different socioeconomic groups, etc., etc. I have that sample. But so how do I make sure that in that sample I have sufficient representation of children with disabilities, but also let's assume that I have sampled enough sample as part of the entire student population. How do I then run this validated instrument? Because how I do the reading assessment, for instance, with just the assessor walks into the school, randomly selects the child, there is a pre-agreement with the teacher and school. There is not much of individual parents' engagement at that point. But if we are looking for disaggregation with the validated instruments, it looks like before I assess a child, I would need to work with parent or caregiver to run this validated instrument first for every child, I assume, or maybe for the child which I assume is a child with disability, and then only move to the reading assessment. So this is what I cannot figure out, how in practice is this happening?
So that was a great question, Meiko. Let me answer from the how-to note perspective, and then if anyone wants to jump in from the practice perspective, like Laura and Trifine or anyone, please do. So you asked two good questions. I picked up on two questions there, one on sampling and one on how you actually implement the tools, given that in truth, we're talking about two different tools here, right? We're talking about a tool that looks at whatever learning outcome, perhaps it's a reading tool, an EGRA, and a tool that detects disability
Exactly. Yes.
status. Yeah, great. So in terms of the sampling question, first of all, if the case you're talking about is a case where the activity is not specifically targeting learners with disability, but you know you have learners who have disabilities in your activity. So in that case, we don't require you to sample specifically for a disability status. This is a little tricky, I will admit, statistically, it's not perfect. But what we mean is we don't expect that you're stratifying your sample by disability status and making sure that you sample until you get a certain quota, perhaps, of individuals who have a disability. We don't require that. Instead, we expect you to do your random sampling across all the children or youth or learners in your program, and implement the disability disaggregation tool with all of those, for all of those learners in that sample who have been selected to take the learning outcome tool.
Oh, that's a perfect answer. So, okay, so I have my sample already, with disaggregated by different factors, stratified by different factors. And then first I run the disability validated tool with all of them, with parents or caregivers. And then only I do the reading instrument, the reading test.
Yeah, to your point, they right now, because the tools for children require a different respondent, right? An EGRA, for example, or an EGMA requires you to deliver it directly with the child, and the disability disaggregation tools require you to deliver it with the caregiver or a newer tool that we're trying to validate now, the teacher. You would have to run separate data collection of events. Yeah.
Thank you. That perfectly answers my question.
Oh, I'm very glad, and I'm happy. Leah and I know Laura and Trifina as well are happy to work with all the rest of you on the phone today on a case-by-case basis. If you have questions about your particular case, we're really happy to hear those after this call, because I'm sorry, I'm looking at the time and we're running short. So let me show you a couple of more things. We've talked a lot today about the tools and resources available to you. There's our how-to note, which shares a little bit of what we shared in the presentation today, our best practices brief, and then this tool selection guide that is intended, it's interactive, it's intended to walk you through the steps to find the right validated tool for you. And we also want to let you know, and this speaks to some of the things that Trifine, Laura, and Medico just raised, that we are currently investing in a pilot of a tool that can be delivered with teachers as the respondents. And we're doing that through the Center for Education and DDI, the ID Hub. And we're also potentially working on a validation of the Washington Group short set with youth under the age of 18, so that we can hopefully, we hope to learn that the Washington Group short set can be implemented with youth ages 15 to 17, so that that tool can be more useful for our youth programming that tends to target youth ages 15 and up. We have a lot of requests for you, though, in this collaborative effort to advance our ability to understand and serve learners with disabilities. First, support, as many of you are, disability measurement in the context of your activities. Incentivize partners, as I think it was Trifine raised, incentivize partners to budget funds for this purpose in their proposals, and do it at the design stage. Next, engage governments and partners, as we heard from Trifine and Laura, in this effort to contribute to strengthening local systems alongside strengthening our activity data collection. And then engage with us. We have lots of ideas about small pilots we can do, small validation studies we can do through existing and forthcoming programming to expand the number of tools we have available to us to collect disability disaggregation data. We don't have a ton of time left. We've already gotten some questions. If you have any more questions, please do put them in the chat. We will respond to your questions afterwards if we don't get to them right now. And also we have a poll, an exit poll that we would like you all to take, if you would. And if you can go down to, in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, there's a cluster of shapes, a triangle, a square, and a circle. If you click on that, you can then select polls and answer the two polls. I'm sorry, Trifine has her hand raised. Trifine, let me hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, I wanted to highlight the importance of screening or identifying learners with disabilities, because it helps us understand the severity of the issue. Because I know as inclusive development, we always try to promote integrated kind of programs, but sometimes depending on the issues, the challenges these learners with disabilities are facing, we may be able to refer them to specialized schools. So it's really very important that we efficiently do the identification and the screening to understand if these learners will be able to really go into an integrated school, no more public or private schools, instead of going to the specialized schools, or whether it's critical, it's really very needed to send the person to the specialized school through deferrals. So we need to understand that as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Trifine. Yes, there's a lot of that we need to do and understand on screening and early identification. And I think that could be our next webinar series, where we really focus in on that particular aspect of inclusive education. Thank you everybody again for joining. We're past time. We appreciate your engagement and your interest, and we look forward to being in touch with you. Thank you. Bye-bye.